Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and today we're going to be talking about poetry. So it's kind of fitting actually that Kelly and I we moved our religion books from this bookcase to another bookcase across the room and put our poetry and our biographies of poets on this bookcase. So when we did that a couple of weeks ago, I was not anticipating making a video along these lines at the time, so it's just it's just kind of fortuitous. But there have been a couple of videos here in recent weeks. There was one from about a month ago that was on Emily Butler's channel, and in that video, there's just an extraordinary kind of breakdown of no pun intended of how to use line breaks in poetry, and I just loved that video and had been thinking about making a response to it anyway. And then I think on Friday, I think it was on Friday, my friend Matt Wall, whose channel is Paperback Junkie, put up a video. I think the video is actually called "It's All BS," in very Matt fashion. About poetry and what his ideas about poetry are. And I found myself watching his video. I found myself agreeing with some of what he had to say and disagreeing with a lot of what he had to say. But more than that, I just found my brain, I don't know, I guess seeking out kind of nooks and crannies in the debate that that he wasn't necessarily covering. Which was fine. I mean, he wasn't intending to go there. His video was looking to do kind of one explicit thing, right? To paint poetry in one specific way. And he did a very good job of that. But I found myself wanting to make a response video. I mean, almost immediately. I found myself wanting to make a response video. So I thought that this response video could kind of function as responses to both of those videos, to Matt's video and to Emily's video. All right, so before I kind of leap into this, right, and start talking about what poetry is to me, what I think of as poetry, I should probably let you know in a nutshell what Matt's video communicated. And I will leave links to these videos below too, just so you know. But Matt talked about how poetry should be a kind of raw, unfiltered, untethered, expression of the gut, expression of the soul, and that when a poet tinkers with things too much, when they go back and they revise and they shape and they manipulate the word choice, manipulate the line breaks, etc., that the poem is losing its power on some level, right? Because that initial gut punch is being somehow tempered. It's being essentially being made to play nice. Is probably a good way to put it. And for Matt, poetry should be about instinct and the absence of censorship, the absence of refinement, even, really. And I do think that there's a place for poetry like that. I really do. I'm not a big fan of most poetry like that, but so for instance, right, when Matt is talking about poetry along those lines, right? Poetry that is somehow raw and plain spoken and is not, being, the meaning of which is not being concealed behind, a lot of metaphor and a lot of kind of dolled up, language with alliteration and assonance and all of these kind of self-conscious devices and tics that poets have or that they bring to bear in the process of revision. While I don't necessarily read a lot of the poetry that is, plain spoken in that kind of raw, blunt, kind of brute punch of a way. I do read quite a lot of poetry that is plain spoken in rather a gentle way, I suppose. And so while it's not kind of raw and shocking or bracing in the way that some of the poetry that Matt was talking about is, it's poetry that seems simple and seems feels very, very easy to apprehend and to comprehend. And so I just wanted to read one of those poems. Flipping through one of my all-time favorite collections here. This is My Name is William Tell by William Stafford. So here's a poem called At the 30th Reunion. And again, right, you'll see that this is a poem that seems to reveal itself, its meaning, its intent, at just a cursory glance with one reading. At the 30th Reunion. That afternoon when it rained and you shared an umbrella with a freshman through the college grove, remember? This is a message propped here casually, like your gesture that day for a no one going by alone. They have had 3 wars. They've changed how to live. The grove is gone. This thanks is for you, so late. I always intended to find you. So there's nothing fancy or ornate or tricksy about that poem, right? It is it's pretty plain, and it manages to be really, really moving at the same time. And another poet who is well known for those really direct and lovely and I don't know, I suppose inviting might be a good word. Inviting poems was Jane Kenyon. And so here's a poem called Not Writing. 6 lines long, but somehow it's still filled with lots of possibility, right? I mean, there's the apparent meaning in the 6 lines, and just the fact that the poem is called Not Writing speaks volumes about the different directions you could take this poem in terms of interpretation. A wasp rises to its papery nest under the eaves where it daubs at the gray shape, but seems unable to enter its own house. Now, this is a poem, ostensibly, about a wasp. But the fact that Kenyon titled this Not Writing, it points us in the direction of reading the wasp as a metaphor for the poet, right? So we have this 6-line poem about a wasp somehow trying to enter its little hive or whatever it is, little wasp houses are called, and we're encouraged to see the wasp as a poet who is, whether it's writer's block or some other kind of struggle, right? Maybe the poet is somehow too frazzled or made frantic by his or her life, but somehow they can't kind of navigate the channels into the act of writing, right? Into the place where they feel most themselves, where they feel comfortable and they feel safe and they feel like they know what to expect. And that's extraordinary that she can do that. I mean, the poem itself, like I said, it's 6 lines, but man, it's also I don't know, like two and a half dozen words is all, right? I mean, it's almost a haiku or something. It's so simple, but there's so much going on with it. And oftentimes just the title of a poem can work with the meaning or reveal the meaning of the poem. Going back to William Stafford here, speaking of titles, one of my favorite poems of his is called Awareness. And what I love about this poem is how the title, that single word, it works with each line in the poem, right? So awareness of a summer day, of what moves in the trees, of your own departing, of that branch no one else notices, of time what it carries, the sideways drift of it, of hiding important things because they don't belong in the world, of now, of maybe, of something different being true, right? Awareness of all of these things. It's just lovely, right? So those are kind of my examples, I suppose, of the kind of poetry that Matt is talking about, right? Poetry that seems to I don't know, spring kind of fully formed from the gut, right? And I mean, maybe that's not the case. I have no way of knowing to what extent William Stafford or Jane Kenyon revised any of these poems. I have no way of knowing that. But they do feel like really clear observations, right? Like they saw the poem in themselves, in their own mind's eye, and it was just a matter of kind of allowing it to escape from them, right? Allowing it to find its way onto the page. But so I suppose what I would say is that's just one kind of poetry, and beyond even that, right? Beyond it just being one kind of poetry among many, I would say that's just one of the many missions of poetry. One of the many aims of a poet is to write something like that from the gut. Now, there are other poets who are much more kind of, I suppose, precise and mannered and given to tailoring language for what it can do to the meaning of the poem, right? They look at these devices like alliteration and what have you, the music of the language that they choose, the ordering of the words, etc., and they look at the language as another kind of doorway into the meaning, or a way of clarifying the meaning of the poem, right? So when I was talking to Matt the other day, one of the poems that sprang to mind immediately, just off the top of my head, was Sylvia Plath's Lesbos, right, from her collection Ariel. And again, right, the importance of title, right, Lesbos being that, I think it was an island, right, off the coast of Greece, that is inextricably kind of bound up with Sappho. Anyway, so the poem begins: viciousness in the kitchen, the potatoes hiss. It is all Hollywood, windowless, right? The fluorescent light wincing on and off like a terrible migraine, coy paper strips for doors, stage curtains, a widow's frizz, and I, love, am a pathological liar. And my child, look at her, face down on the floor, little unstrung puppet kicking to disappear. Why, she is schizophrenic, her face red and white, a panic. You have stuck her kittens outside your window in a sort of cement well where they crap and puke and cry, and she can't hear. So, and the poem goes on. I mean, it's 3 pages long. It's a very, very long poem. But so one of the things that Plath is doing in this poem is, it seems clear to me, is that she is addressing her significant other, who has either left her with these children, which was the case in real life, right? Ted Hughes had essentially functionally abandoned Sylvia Plath and their two little kids, and what Plath is doing from the very beginning of this, right? Viciousness in the kitchen, the potatoes hiss. So she's taking images and ideas and locales, right, that tend to be associated with home, with comfort, with family, with domesticity. She's taking these things, right, the kitchen, the potatoes, and she's making them menacing. She's making them dangerous somehow. And it's not just the fact that she chooses viciousness as the first word in the poem, right? She creates this pronounced sibilance with these first few lines, right? Viciousness in the kitchen, the potatoes hiss, it is all Hollywood windowless. And what that sibilance does is, it's all down to the word choice, right? There are a lot of ways that she could have communicated this very thing, but by going after those strong S sounds, it puts one in mind of snakes. It feels sinister. It feels dangerous. And so what she's doing is she is, again, taking something that we associate with comforts, right? Kitchens, potatoes, etc., and she is making them into something poisonous or toxic. So as a result, I mean, the poem from the very beginning feels dangerous, principally because of the word choice. So Matt and I went back and forth a little bit about to what extent Plath might have revised this poem. And my instinct is that that these words were arrived at after a process of revision, and Matt wasn't so sure, right? And having a look at the restored edition of Ariel, it seems very much so like the beginning of this poem anyway, kind of sprang out of Plath in the sense that Matt really appreciates, right? It seems to have been a raw, kind of unchecked expression. Now, the point about that I would like to make is that because there is so much music at work in this, and because she was clearly so in choosing these words, even if it was right out of the gate, like the restored edition of Ariel seems to indicate, I wonder about how poets sometimes revise in their minds before they get the words down on the page, because these lines are so carefully crafted, and they're crafted with an eye to the sounds of the words and what those sounds do to embellish the meaning, to deepen the meaning of the poem, right? And that, for Matt, that was the biggest thing, right? That is that poems, that the meaning's the most important thing of a poem. And while I think that is often the case, I think there is something to be said for poems that are less interested in meaning than they are in the experience of reading them. Okay, and and Matt is very down on form for himself, right? I mean, he understands that form has its place, certainly in the past, and that rhyme as well it's very difficult to do, and I would agree with that. Rhyme is very, very difficult to do in a way that doesn't feel trite. And but when poets are capable of that, when they're paying that kind of attention to form, to the structure of something, to rhymes, at the ends of lines, at the ends of enjambed lines, right? Because one of the things that it does, right? So rhyming poetry, and I realize Lesbos isn't a rhyming poem, but rhyming poetry tends to feel trite when those lines are end stopped, right? Which Emily talks a lot about in her video. The rhymes that appear at the ends of enjambed lines, one of the wonderful things they do is that they kind of pull you through the poem, right? To bring up snakes again, they kind of snake their way through the poem. And there's something to be said for poems that do that pay that kind of attention to form, that pull your eye through the work itself. And one of my favorite poems that does this is by Christian Wiman, right, from his collection Every Riven Thing. And I wish I could put this on the screen for you to see it. But this poem is called After the Diagnosis. So I'm going to read it through, and then we can talk about some of the rhyming, some of the repetition, and then the meaning of the poem as well. Because this poem, for me, works on many, many levels, okay? I think the meaning is rather stark and harrowing, that there's something beautiful at work in it as well. But then the structure of the thing, the word choice, the care, right? And so I realize I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. But one of the things I love about poetry is when poets remember that it's a craft, I suppose, right? And that's one of the things I love so much about revision. When I was writing a lot of poetry myself, the act of revision was really thrilling for me, because it reminded me that I was a craftsman, right? That it wasn't just about getting my heart out on the page. It was about letting the act of crafting the poem reveal to me what my heart was saying in the first place, if that makes any sense. But anyway, so this is After the Diagnosis by Christian Wiman. No remembering now when the apple sapling was blown almost out of the ground. No telling how, with all the other trees around, it alone was struck. It must have been luck, he thought for years, so close to the house it grew. It must have been night. Change is a thing one sleeps through when young, and he was young. If there was a weakness in the earth, a give, he went down on his knees to find and feel the limits of there is no longer. If there was one random blow from above, the way he's come to know from years in this place, the roots were stronger. Whatever the case, he has watched this tree survive wind ripping at his roof for nights on end, heats and blights that left little else alive. No remembering now. A day's changes mean all to him, and all days come down to one clear pane, through which he sees, among all the other trees, this leaning, clenched, unyielding one that seems cast in the form of a blast that would have killed it, as if something at the heart of things, and with the heart of things, had willed it. So let's start with the meaning of this, okay? The metaphor, right? This idea of the tree, right? That has been nearly uprooted, nearly entirely uprooted, right? And like he says there at the end, seems cast in the form of a blast that would have killed it, right? So the poem's called After the Diagnosis. This book is primarily made up of poems that Christian Wiman wrote during his treatment for an incurable bone cancer that he had and has. Again, right? I mean, it's in remission now, but who knows when it'll come back. And so this idea of the speaker in the poem, right? The presence, the consciousness in the poem, seeing this tree that was so close to the house, always so close to the house, right? Its proximity to the place where one feels safe, to home, I think is important, right? That a tree can be subject to weather, right? To storms, to forces that can nearly kill it, that can nearly uproot it, despite the fact of its proximity to home, to the window pane, right? And it's P-A-N-E in the poem. A day's changes mean all to him, and all days come down to one clear pane, through which he sees among all the other trees this leaning, clenched, unyielding one, right? But what I love about that is the double meaning of that word pain, right? Because we can imagine it, when we hear it read, we can imagine it spelled P-A-I-N as well, right? All days come down to one clear pane through which he sees among all the other trees. And so again, right? I mean, there are lots of ways that he could have said that, but the choice of that word pain, and it may have been, right, that may have come about in the process of revision after it was all done, right, after he got all the raw material of the poem out, or it could have been done. Christian Wiman has said that when he writes a poem, he doesn't start with an idea or an image or a feeling. He starts with a sound, and he looks for the words to fit that sound. So, which leads me to believe that he does a lot of revision in his mind, with his ears, before he even sits down at the computer or sits down at the pen and paper, because that is just such a carefully chosen word, right? And it I don't know, it just reveals so many possibilities of meaning, double, triple meanings in this poem. But let's just get on to the language here. No remembering now when the apple sapling was blown, right? Apple sapling is just a beautiful phrase. Was blown almost out of the ground. No telling how, with all the other trees around. It alone was struck, right? And again, right, I mean, that makes you wonder, that puts you in the mind of somebody who has gone through a diagnosis like this. Why me, right? Of all these people, why did the storm find me? And so here we have in this poem, we have a consciousness recognizing the tree, but also being the tree as well, right? The tree is representative of what the speaker, what the consciousness in the poem is going through, even as they're standing outside it, right? It's almost a kind of out-of-body experience happening in this poem. They're standing outside it and witnessing what is happening to their body. It alone was struck. It must have been luck, he thought for years, so close to the house it grew. It must have been night. Change is a thing one sleeps through when young, and he was young, right? But I love those rhymes, right? Grew and through. And again, right, I mean, like Matt was saying, that it can feel trite. Rhyme can often feel trite. But I think, for me, the thing that saves poetry, that is doing things with rhyme or doing things very, very self-consciously with form, right? And the title poem in this, Every Riven Thing, is probably my favorite poem. And that is a poem that begins each stanza with the same words in the same order, but through punctuation and capitalization and enjambment. I mean, it reinvents the line, even though it's precisely the same line. It reinvents the line with each stanza. And so when poets are kind of super attentive to form like that, or they're super attentive to rhyme and to the ways in which enjambment can kind of pull them through a poem, or pull the reader through a poem. One of the things that saves those poems from feeling trite or dated, or just of another era, right? Of a kind of old mothballed, fusty era of poetry, is what they're communicating. And this poem is communicating something that is so timeless, that is so universal, that it's something that all of us are going to go through at some point in our lives. And if we don't go through it ourselves, we're going to see people that we love go through this, wrestling with a diagnosis, right? And it's, on some level, it's the stuff of a Lifetime movie. It's the stuff of soap opera. But what a poet can do is they can take that material and they can elevate it. And that's what he does here in this poem. So, just a few more thoughts, I suppose. I've got all these different poetry books pulled down off the shelf. When I was talking to Matt about this the other day, and I was talking to Kelly about it last night as well, what are my thoughts on poetry? Now, there are some points with Matt where I am in complete agreement, right? There are poets out there who are so pretentious, who are so pompous, whose heads are so far up their own asses, that the poetry becomes completely inscrutable, right? You see this in works of fiction as well sometimes, right? Like, for me, it would be something like The Silmarillion by Tolkien, which I have read, or Finnegan's Wake by Joyce, which I haven't read. It seems very much like art as masturbation, right? Like these are people who are writing with no regard at all for an audience. And there are poets who do that as well, right? I remember being in high school, I think a senior in high school, and I think the book was, the collection was The Dream of the Unified Field. I thought it was The Kingfisher, but it doesn't even look like there's a poem called The Kingfisher in there that I can see anyway. But it was a collection by Jory Graham, and I think the collection actually won the Pulitzer Prize. I was looking at it this morning, and I seem to remember that seal on the cover on Goodreads. And there were poems in that collection I thought were really beautiful. But there were also poems in that collection that felt so alienating and so precious and so little interested in me not only understanding them but engaging with them or identifying with them, and it really put me off. It really made me angry. I mean, so as a result, I never bought any of Jory Graham's poetry. I don't own any of it. I have been in workshops with poets like that. I knew them as an undergrad. I knew them as a graduate student. Fortunately, I was never in any of their workshops in graduate school, because that would have been the definition of insufferable. But so that's the thing. Like, I recognize that there's poetry out there like that, and there's also poetry out there that seems to be like that, right? That seems to be really up its own ass. But I can recognize that there's something rich and valuable going on in it, and I'm just kind of not there yet. I'm not in a place where I can meet the poetry on the terms that the poet is proposing, right? I have difficulty with T.S. Eliot for that reason. I have difficulty with, and I really wish I didn't, but I have difficulty with Gerard Manley Hopkins for that reason, right? I mean, I feel like there's a kind of cerebral engine or kiln at work in poems by people like Eliot and Hopkins that I'm just not there yet as a reader. I'm just not at that place, at that level. And it could be that I'm just, as a reader, I'm looking for different things in poetry than what those writers are kind of putting on the table for us as readers to experience, and we change as readers of poetry, right? I mean, when I was in college, when I was at community college, and even as a university student, as an undergrad at university, William Stafford was my favorite poet, right? Before that, Sylvia Plath was my favorite poet in my late teens, very early 20s. Then it was Stafford, and now it's Christian Wiman, right? A poet who is doing much more interesting things with form, much more kind of self-conscious things with form than any of the poets I really, really gravitated to when I was younger. So we have to acknowledge that as well, right? That the poetry that is going to make the most sense to you is going to, I don't know, sound your tuning fork, the tuning fork in your soul, when you're in your 20s is going to be different from the poetry, is likely going to be different than the poetry that does that for you in your 40s or 50s or 60s, right? Who knows what poets, maybe when I'm in my 60s, maybe I'll be ready for T.S. Eliot and Gerard Manley Hopkins. Maybe they will make sense to me in a way that they can't possibly now, right? Because of all of the life experience I will accrue and the reading experience I will accrue between now and then. Maybe all of that is what I need to prepare me for that. But in the end, I'll say that, the analogy when I was talking to Kelly last night, the analogy I was thinking of was with cinema. And what I want from a work of art, whether it's a poem or whether it's a film or whether it's a novel, what I want above all from a work of art is I want to be challenged, right? I want to, William Stafford, I was telling Matt this the other day, William Stafford had this idea that I think he got from William Blake. And the idea is that, you can be walking through a wood and you'll come up on the end of a golden string. And you take it up and you handle it gently because you don't want to break it, but you follow it. And if you're careful enough with it, it will lead you to Jerusalem's wall, right? It will lead you to a kind of paradise. I want works of art that extend that invitation, that give me the end of that golden string and trust me to follow it, right? Without spoon-feeding everything to me, right, in a film or in a novel, or without being too obvious in a poem, right? Even if it's, right, like with the Kenyon or Stafford poems, even if it seems obvious at the outset, right, even if the poem seems so clearly to mean just one thing, I want there to be more to it, right? I want the act of reading it to be following that golden string, and you know, and discovering that there's more in it, right? That I can go deeper in it, even if it's only 6 lines long. You know, and you see it in cinema with films like Mulholland Drive by David Lynch. Now, David Lynch is a filmmaker who, like those pompous poets, he can disappear up his own ass with the best of them. Lost Highway is a movie in which he does that. But Mulholland Drive is one of these movies that it gives us just enough clues. You know, it establishes this kind of mystery and this mood that leaves us wanting to understand what we don't understand. And so we watch it again and we understand a little bit more, and we watch it again and we understand a little bit more. And finally, with Mulholland Drive, ideally, you reach a point where it feels like it has so many layers, that it's operating in so many registers, and you're just left marveling at it. And that's what I want poems to do for me as well, right? I want to be awed by what the poet is doing with language and with structure. I want to be awed at what the poem is communicating in terms of meaning, in terms of relevance for me. I want poems to do all of those things for me. I want them to push as many buttons for me as they can. Those are my few thoughts on poetry. There's loads more to say, but this video is already going to be really, really long. So I will leave it there. Let me know what you think below. Let me know who some of your favorite poets are. Let me know what you look for in poetry, what you expect from poetry, what you hope poetry can inspiring you, can summon in you, what you ideally want poetry to affect in you. I'd be really, really curious to know. But anyway, sorry if this was a little kind of all over the map, but I knew it was going to be when I had the idea. And so there it is. But I will see you guys again very soon. Adios.